I came across this week in this study, and it was in Acts 6. And you remember in this passage that there was this issue where these widows were being neglected in the daily distribution. And so the apostles, this was a very important thing, but they weren't able to take care of this because they had their own responsibilities. And if you'll remember, this group of Christians were to pick from among them men to take care of these needs. Brothers, do you remember that the apostle says that they must devote themselves to what? They must devote themselves, and if you're like me, you'll say, well, to the ministry of the word. They couldn't wait tables. They had to devote themselves to the ministry of the word. When you go back to Acts chapter 6, that's not the first thing that they say. They say, we must devote ourselves to prayer and the ministry of the word. And I think that's very significant. When's the last time, and I guess here's my gym question, if I can say it that way. When's the last time you felt like your life is devoted to prayer? Now, one may say, maybe that was an apostle thing. It wasn't that the deacons or these individuals, or for that matter, any of them, were not to be devoted to prayer. But I think the significance is they could not do the ministry of the word if they weren't devoted in prayer. The reality is we know that an apostle of Jesus Christ, Paul, for example, to those in Thessalonica said, rejoice always, pray without ceasing. So this was not an apostle thing. Are we devoted to prayer? And so this morning, and I only have one word for you. In this series, I'm typically just going to have one word for you because I don't want us to be distracted with anything else. You got your notebooks? Listen, here it is. Prayer. That's your one word. And that's all we need to focus in on this morning. Prayer. You know that Jesus prayed. I guess if I were to give the perfect lesson on this, I would only focus in on Jesus. You know that He prayed. And you know that He prayed all the time. And you know sometimes they were short prayers and sometimes they were long prayers. Sometimes they were in crowds, sometimes they were on mountains. They were private, they were public. They were for the physical, they were for the spiritual, they were for others, they were for Himself. All of this. Jesus Christ was a praying man, and we know this. We don't have a problem knowing this. We get this intellectually. Why, brethren, do I struggle with prayer? Why do you struggle with being devoted to prayer? Do you know what I mean by that? Is anyone in here totally satisfied with how much they pray? Listen, if you are, I'm genuinely happy for you and proud for you. I'm still not there yet. So what I want to do this morning for the few minutes that we have is I want to play on the same take that the Hebrew writer did, in that in order so that these brethren would not drift away. That's the issue with Hebrews, right? Drift away. He's trying to show how rich Jesus fulfills all these things they grew up with, this Old Testament worship, and he wants them to see the power behind what they grew up. And I want us to go back to take the same approach. We're going to look at Hebrews chapter 9 and break this down, and I want to paint an awesome picture, what I believe is an awesome picture about prayer. And so we go back to Hebrews chapter 9. And I'm going to start this focusing on the altar of incense. Hebrews chapter 9, beginning in verse 1. Now, even the first covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly place of holiness. So what the Hebrew writer is going to do is we're going to remind them of the earthly worship, and he's now going to show them how everything was fulfilled through Jesus Christ. But hold on to the Christ fulfillment part for a moment. For a tent was prepared, the first section in which were the lampstand and the table and the bread of presence. It is called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a second section called the most holy place, having the golden altar of incense and the ark of the covenant covered on all sides with gold, in which was a golden urn holding the manna and Aaron's staff that budded and the tablets of the covenant. Above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail, but we're going to be able to go back and speak a little bit more of this in detail. These preparations Having thus been made, the priests go regularly into the first section, performing their ritual duties. But into the second, only the high priest goes, and he but once a year, and not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and for the unintentional sins of the people. By this, the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the holy place is not yet opened, as long as the first section is still standing, which is symbolic for the present age. According to this arrangement, gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, but deal only with food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until the time of Reformation. Brethren, I know I just said a lot there. Read a lot, I should say. But hold on. Hold on for just a moment. You know this stuff. So, where's my fancy laser pointer? I forgot. Okay, use your eyes. So, here's the tabernacle, right? Oh. Thank you, good sir. Ha! This is the tabernacle. The outer courts here. This is the altar where they bring their bulls in, their sacrifices. They offer it to the Lord. Burn on this altar. This is where you wash, you clean yourself before you enter into the holy place. Okay. You enter in to the holy place. This is like 15 by 15 by 30. You walk in. To the left-hand side, you're going to have the lampstand. Extinguished every morning, lit every evening. Represented, come to represent the Spirit of God. On the right-hand side, the table of showbread. 2 sections, 12 loaves each. This is going to remind you that God provides. Right here, you're going to have the altar of incense. We're going to discuss this in just a moment in detail. The altar of incense. Let's look at some of these passages. This is pretty much what this would have looked like. And right here on the 4 corners, you're going to have these little horns. On the Day of Atonement, whenever the blood is brought in, they would actually be put on these 4 horns. But let's look at these passages together for just a moment. Exodus chapter 30 is going to be really important for our study this morning. Of course, you have in verse 1, you shall make an altar of which to burn incense. You shall make it of acacia wood. So, again, here's our altar of incense. Now, skip forward. I want you to consider, look at verse 35 through 38. So we know we've got this altar in which you burn incense, right? Something very important about this incense. Verse 35. And make an incense blended as by the perfumer, seasoned with salt, pure and holy. You shall beat some of it very small, and put part of it before the testimony in the tent of meeting, where I shall meet with you. It shall be most holy for you. And the incense that you shall make according to its composition, you shall not make for yourselves. It shall be for you holy to the Lord. Whoever makes any like it to use as a perfume shall be cut off from his people. I want you to think about how important this is. So you got this altar of incense. And this incense had a special ingredient to be prepared by a special people. So holy was this, because it was separated for the Lord, that if you were found among the Jewish nation to have this incense for your own use, you were cut off from God's people. Just if your mind's already going there, Leviticus chapter 10, Nadab and Abihu, the strange fire, this was it. This was the strange, unauthorized fire that was given to the Lord, the incense that they burned. It was an unauthorized fire. Interesting, too, because this is going to be done inside the holy place. No one even sees it. It doesn't matter. God saw it. So this is a very, very holy aspect to the altar. Look at verse 6 back up in chapter 30. And you shall put it in front of the veil that is above the ark of the testimony, in front of the mercy seat that is above the testimony, where I will meet with you. So, what we have here is this altar of incense is right before this veil. This veil is the one that separates the holy place from the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. Now, the Hebrew writer talks about it as if it's inside, but we can tell the point he's trying to attach that to the Ark of the Covenant and to its purpose, its function. But in reality, it was actually on this side of the veil, which we will see. Okay, so back to the text here. Verse 7. This is, once it goes into, they go into the Holy of Holies, God would meet with them there. And Aaron shall burn fragrant incense on it. Every morning when he dresses the lamps, he shall burn it. And when Aaron sets up the lamps at twilight, he shall burn it. A regular incense offering before the Lord throughout your generations. So I don't want you to forget this. What was happening every single day is that priests would come in and they would burn in the morning and evening. They would put a fresh fire to this incense. So all the time, this altar of incense is burning and the smoke is going. Back to our text here. Verse 9. You shall not offer unauthorized incense on it, or a burnt offering, or a grain offering, and you shall not pour a drink offering on it. Aaron shall make atonement on its horns once a year. With the blood of the sin offering of atonement, he shall make atonement for it once in the year throughout your generations. It is most holy to the Lord. So there would be something specific in that once a year, this blood was going to be on the four corners of that altar. But there was nothing that was supposed to be offered on that. It was purely for the incense. Now, of course, as I've talked about, we have the most holy place. This is a perfect 15 by 15 by 15 room. And in this room, you find the Ark of the Covenant. And within that covenant, you're going to find the manna, which represents, again, God's bread and His word for His people. You're going to see Aaron's staff that budded, which showed his leadership, who God had chosen. And you're also going to find the 2 tablets of stone. On top of that is the mercy seat with the 2 cherubim facing each other, wings extended out, touching. Now, here's a really cool passage, and this is Leviticus chapter 16. Verse 11. This is now talking about this special day of the year, the Day of Atonement. Aaron shall present the bull as a sin offering for himself, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. He shall kill the bull as a sin offering for himself, and he shall take a censer full of coals of fire from the altar before the Lord, and 2 handfuls of sweet incense, beaten small, and he shall bring it inside the veil, and put the incense of the fire before the Lord, that the cloud of the incense may cover the mercy seat, that it is over the testimony. The mercy seat that is over the testimony, so that he does not die. So, something that's kind of terrifying, but also really powerful, is that this one day of the year, the high priest will go in to the Holy of Holies, and he'll take this censer with this incense that he's burning, and it'll burn, and the smoke will fill up the Holy of Holies. It takes over everything, and then the Lord would meet with his high priest on that day whenever that Holy of Holies was covered. The altar of incense, that's what it was. That was its basic function. But brethren, something powerful I want us to consider is the incense of prayer. In Revelation chapter 5, verse 8, you have this wonderful scene before the throne of God. You have God on the throne. You have this lamb that's present that comes and takes this scroll. What you're also going to have is these 4 creatures and these 24 elders that have been praising and worshiping. But it's really interesting in verse 8, and when he had taken the scroll that is the Lamb, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each holding a harp and a golden bowl, and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. It tells you. What's happening in this revelation is it's giving a lot of Old Testament symbolism, and it's telling you that now these bowls of incense are the prayers of the saints. This is not some fancy preacher's thing of what he's trying to do with incense. They're telling you that in this glorious scene, the incense are the prayers of the saints. Here's another cool one. I've never connected any of these dots before, but when you go to Luke chapter 1, Luke chapter 1, Zechariah, who is a priest of God, this is going to be the father of John the Baptist. Now keep in mind before I read this passage, at this point, he and his wife, they're advanced in age and without child. They've been praying to God for a child. Now look at this. Beginning in verse 8. Now while he was serving as priest before God, when his division was on duty, according to the custom of the priesthood, he was chosen by lot to enter the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And the whole multitude of the people were praying outside at the hour of incense. And there appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing on the right side of the altar of incense. And Zechariah was troubled when he saw him, and fear fell upon him. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John." Cool. How cool is this? So he's chosen to go in, a great honor for him, to burn incense. Meanwhile, while that's going on, the congregation outside is praying at the hour of incense. Very appropriate. An angel of the Lord appears by the altar of incense and says, "We've heard your incense." God's heard your prayer, and you're going to be with child. Now, I'll say as a side note, Zechariah, he falls in the same trap we all do. We pray, and then God actually delivers on it, and then we act surprised. And it's because he's so surprised that his mouth is shut up and he can't talk, because he doubted. That's why James tells you, for example, in the context of James chapter 1, it's about wisdom, but get the point. Ask in faith with no doubting. Because God can hear and because God can answer. Here's going back even further. Psalm chapter 141. Psalm 141. Excuse me. David wrote long ago, "O Lord, I call upon you, hasten to me. Give ear to my voice when I call to you. Let my prayer be counted as incense before you, and the lifting up of my hands as the evening sacrifice." Don't tell me that no one in the Old Testament didn't see that these things were symbolic for something else. Don't tell me that. He got it. David wasn't the only one that you read about in the Old Testament that makes a point that God really, he couldn't care less about all the animals being sacrificed, all the blood poured out, if the hands weren't clean and if the heart wasn't right. Brethren, they understood that. David saying, "Lord, I don't come with the altar of incense, and I don't come with an animal offering, but I give you my clean hands and I throw up my prayer before you. And I know that you hear that." Brethren, have you thought about your prayers being the sweet aroma, this incense to God? Because they are. It's the incense of prayer. And so because of this, as the Hebrew writer pointed out, and as we're able to go back and dig just a little bit into some of these passages, I want to submit to you that our prayer should be, number one, it should be appreciated by us. I should appreciate prayer. And I commend you, because I've heard so many of you say this, how powerful it is that we are able to pray to our God. So I try to do some rough estimation. Let's say this tabernacle was erected in about 1450 BC. And being generous, if every high priest got to serve for about 60 years, let's say, from the time that they were able to serve until they were done, and being generous because worship wasn't always available because of destruction, there was maybe like 20 to 30 high priests that ever got to actually serve and go into the Holy of Holies. Brethren, this is a very, very powerful thing that God has blessed us with. Jesus, at his death, there was an earthquake, but there was also what that happened? And that veil that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies was torn from top to bottom. Open for business. Come in. No more stay out. No more if you enter, you die. Jesus Christ offered himself, and that veil was split in two. And now we can come to that throne of grace and mercy and not be timid, but come with confidence and find life, not death. Because of what Jesus Christ did. That's what the Hebrew writer would tell you. That's what he did for you with prayer. So, brethren, here's one of the powerful images I want to leave you with. Whenever you get to pray to God, I want you to think about it this way. If that veil was basically the front door to God's house in that old law, in that old tabernacle, that incense was the doorbell. And they'd bring that incense in, and they would walk into God's presence. Whenever you go to prayer, I want you to think about this maybe the next time you do it today. In your mind, walk into the tabernacle, see that lit lampstand to your right, see the table of showbread to your right, look at that altar of incense before you, take your censer, ring the doorbell, and enter in to the most holy of holies. And there you find him. And your prayers ascend to God. And brethren, throw your prayers up to God. Let the incense lift to him. Brethren, here's another reality. Be constant about it. Pray without ceasing. Maybe the next time you think about that statement from Paul, think about in the old law, that incense was being burned morning and evening. Pray without ceasing. That incense was always there. You always have the opportunity, think about that, to ring that doorbell anytime you want. No more one day of the year with fear. Anytime you want. So this last week, as I was preparing for this, just a coincidence, we're sitting down for dinner, say our prayer, and Braylon's a really good listener. She's paying attention to what's going on. She says, I feel like whenever we say our prayers for dinner, maybe they're a little shorter because maybe we're wanting to eat. Oh, no. No. But I told her, I said, you know what? Whenever Daddy is praying for the meal, it's very specific. I have something very specific on my mind. And so I'm going to God and I'm thanking him for this food. I said, without God, really, we wouldn't have any food to eat. I said, so there's nothing wrong with just focusing in on thanking him for that. I said, but Braylon, you're right. There's nothing wrong with giving him thanks and talking more to him about other things. And I said, which we typically do in some of our other prayers. But I got to tell you, isn't that incredible that I can ring that doorbell just to thank God for my food? I want you to think about it that way. And Jesus did it. Give us our... Yeah. After all, in your mind, whenever you are passing into that Holy of Holies, don't forget that you passed the table of showbread. God did physically provide for his people. And in the ark is the manna. Well, that's the bread of life. True, but don't forget, he literally fed people for 40 years. But to your point, yes, there are bigger things even to pray for. And I think it's also appropriate to say that. And the same prayer that Jesus prays for the daily bread, he also talks about God's kingdom. About temptation. Brethren, the reality is, as I was going through and considering the old law, right now I've just got my own personal study going on prayer. I'm just looking at every single passage. There's no end game. Just take as long as I want. And no doubt about it, in the old law, you have a lot of prayers, not only, but are geared towards the physical. But that also makes sense because God was blessing his people and cursing them in a physical way. So that doesn't mean that they weren't spiritually minded. That was a very real thing. And you see that in the New Testament. But I got to tell you, as you start studying through the New Testament, man, they are so spiritually driven. You need prayers. I need prayers to fight off Satan. You need my prayers. I'm praying for you. You're praying for me. That my strength be strong, or that my faith be strong, that I continue to fight the good fight. That the word may not be hindered, that we go out, that we be bold, that we be confident. I'm not downplaying the physical, but brethren, it doesn't matter what happens physically if we've failed spiritually. And you see that you get to go before the throne of God anytime you want to, and that's why you hear that term prayer warriors. It's kind of cheesy, but hey, I'm not going to beat up on it. Yeah, because those are people that are trying to be devoted to prayer. They're understanding the significance of it. And you know what? You got to have the right coals. Here's something I learned. And you can go and start turning to Leviticus chapter 16. I want to go back to that passage one more time. Leviticus 16. You got to have the right coals. So, on this Day of Atonement, something happened that was a little different from the everyday incense. So again, Aaron, verse 11, shall present the bull as a sin offering for himself, shall make atonement for himself and for his house. He shall kill the bull as a sin offering for himself. And he shall take a censer full of coals of fire from the altar before the Lord, and 2 handfuls of sweet incense beaten small, and he shall bring it inside the veil. If you're not careful in verse 12, you brush over that and you're like, right, he takes coal from the incense. That's actually not what happens. On this day, he takes coals from this altar. I was having to do all this research to try to confirm it, and that's what everyone is pointing to the same thing. On this day, the Day of Atonement, he takes coals from this altar, takes incense in his hands, takes a censer now, a portable censer, and carries the censer into the Holy of Holies, and that lifts up the smoke. You know what's really cool about this? The coals come from the place where sacrifices were presented to God. You know, we are like that altar of incense, and that I feel the same thing probably twice a day. I need to reboot. I need a fire lit in the morning, and I need a fire lit in the evening. Because if you're human, you're like that altar of incense. The flame begins to, right? It begins to smolder, begins to lessen and lessen and lessen. The question is, what do you use to get the fire going again? And what I submit to you, our coals have to be from the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. They have to be. That's what's going to reignite that fire. Because if you try to take worldly coals, it doesn't do the job. That doesn't get a hot flame burning, does it? You're not going to get this incense just billowing up and up and up to God. You're going to get this low-hanging fog that goes nowhere. And brethren, I know you don't want your prayers to be like that, and I don't want my prayers to be like that either. So we got to go to that altar of that's outside where we can find the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, and we got to bring that into the Holy of Holies. That's how we keep motivated. Those are powerful prayers. Those are prayers with meat in them. Those aren't prayers where you don't know what to say. And I'm not talking about whenever we're so deep it's sometimes difficult to get the words out. I'm talking about we're using worldly coals and there's no fire and I just stumble in my prayer to God. You ever been there? That's because those are worldly coals, not based in the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And finally, brethren, they've got to have the right ingredients. That incense was so precious to God. No one else gets to use this. This is for me whenever the prayers come up. Prayers aren't for everyone, are they, brethren? Prayers can be hindered, can they not? But to put it in the most simple way, I like what the blind man said in John chapter 9. He was blind, but he saw more clear than anyone else around him. Funny thing. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners. I guess we could just sum it up that way. Whenever you come into the Holy of Holies, if you will, your incense better be holy. It better be pure. You better be coming with a clean heart and clean hands. You better be living righteous to the Lord. Set apart for Him and His kingdom. One of the reasons, brethren, why our prayers are not effective, why they're not a pleasing aroma to God, why He's not heeding them, is because we have entered in unholy. He wants to change this for you. Brethren, we can never be where we want to be with the Lord if our prayers are hindered. Why are our prayers hindered? That's for you and I to ask ourselves and to evaluate and to encourage each other and acknowledge what it is and then begin to fix it. Let Jesus Christ fix it. So would you please this week join me in real powerful prayer to God? Lift that incense up to Him. Know that He hears you. Know that He will answer you speedily, and you trust in His grace. Please join me this week. If we can help you in any way, we ask that you come to the front as together we stand and we sing.